So thanks for everybody being here. I suspect we'll have more and more attendees show up as we go. I want to thank you, Lee, for joining us for this webinar, The Essence of Integral Flourishing. The webinar is really designed to, even though we're launching the course, which is, we'll talk a lot about, the structure and the form of this really amazing course that we're launching this weekend. I really hope that over the next 60 to 90 minutes, you can all walk away with a really good sort of takeaway value of what flourishing is, how it operates in your life, regardless of whether you go deeper into the course or not. And I think Lee is the perfect host and guide for this. He's worked on flourishing and taught flourishing at the university level for years. He's also one of our beloved Integral Life Practice leaders. And some of you probably already know him and have attended his sessions. So very thankful to have you here with us, Lee, and I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through all of this.
Well, thanks, Rob. And I would also return the compliment because I'm very honored that there's a place such as Integral Life where people can congregate around these ideas of flourishing, but also, of course, the integral framework that helps us to make sense of reality in a way that is as inclusive as possible and is basically the best map that I know of reality. So, yeah,
and that's a really good place where we'll dive into that. So why and I'll ask you this in a bit. Why take an integral approach to flourishing? We'll talk about the marriage of those two models in a bit, but to kick us off, I thought you and I have talked about this, how serendipitous it was that the New York Times just. So Adam Grant does this really fantastic piece in the New York Times about flourishing, and he says, actually, it's about languishing. What is this feeling we're all feeling right now? And he names it, and it was one of the most commented on New York Times pieces of the last year. It was really interesting. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it, but I wanted to start there. So let me start with a quote that comes from that article. Adam writes, "At first, I didn't recognize the symptoms that we all had in common. Friends mentioned that they were having trouble concentrating. Colleagues reported that even with vaccines on the horizon, they were not excited about 2021. A family member was staying up late to watch National Treasure again, even though she knows the movie by heart. And instead of bouncing out of bed at 6 a.m., I was lying there until 7 playing Words with Friends. It wasn't burnout. We still had energy. It wasn't depression. We didn't feel hopeless. We just felt somewhat joyless and aimless. It turns out there's a name for that: languishing. Languishing is a sense of stagnation and emptiness. It feels as if you're muddling through your days, looking at your life through a foggy windshield, and it might be the dominant emotion of 2021. It's the void between depression and flourishing. Languishing is the absence of well-being. You don't have symptoms of mental illness, but you're not the picture of mental health either. You're not functioning at full capacity. Languishing dulls your motivation, disrupts your ability to focus, and triples the odds that you'll cut back on work. It appears to be more common than depression, and in some ways it may be a bigger risk factor for mental illness. And the good news, as Dr. Grant points out, is it can be overcome. And of course, we know how to do it, and that's what your course is about. So jump off from there and tell us about that.
Well, that's a great introduction, Robin. I was also very pleased that the New York Times sort of participated in the kicking off of this course. So the course, The Essence of Integral Flourishing, it combines a large number of insights from the scientific study of human happiness, or what's called academically well-being. And the course combines that scientific insight with the depth and scope of integral philosophy. And throughout the course, participants are invited to engage in at least 60 practical exercises designed to produce a greater sense of flourishing.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. What is flourishing?
Well, according to a psychologist called Martin Seligman, our level of experienced well-being, so how we feel that we're doing, depends on how well we're doing within 5 categories. And these 5 categories are represented by the abbreviation PERMA. So that's PERMA. And I'll share my screen to walk us through the model briefly. So we have indeed the PERMA model here, and the P in PERMA stands for positive emotion. That's basically feeling happy. And the E stands for engagement, or feeling completely absorbed in an activity that we're performing, where, for instance, we lose all track of time. And the
Flow.
R in PERMA, absolutely. So that's a flow state. Yeah. And we'll speak about that more later, I think.
Yeah.
So, but indeed, we can say engagement is flow. Absolutely. And the R in PERMA stands for relationships. So that's basically just feeling connected with each other in a healthy way. And the M stands for meaning, or how much purpose we experience in our life. And the A stands for accomplishment or achievement, both work. And it's about the achievement of goals that are important to us. And later, Seligman added the letter V to the PERMA model. So in the next slide, you can see that it makes the PERMA plus V model. And the V stands for vitality, or feeling fit and energetic. So Seligman very specifically defines flourishing as doing well across the categories of this PERMA plus V model. And what that means is that we're flourishing if we regularly feel happy within positive emotion, if we regularly feel engaged, of course, within engagement, for instance, at work or during sports, and within the category of relationships, if we enjoy healthy relationships with loved ones, within the category of meaning, if we experience a sense of purpose in our life, and within the category of accomplishment, if we're regularly doing things that that help us to achieve goals that we find important, and of course within the category of vitality, that we feel on a regular basis energetic and fit. So, stop sharing that.
That's fantastic. Now, what I was struck by, I mean, I've been doing this stuff a long time, and I've actually done work in this area, and I've written stuff on it as well. And even knowing it, I was struck by how when I went through the course, I would reference that model again and go, I've been missing some things. I've not been in flow states quite as regularly as I'm used to throughout my life. And that's certainly been true the last year and maybe even the last couple of years. I'm probably not feeling as purposeful in certain areas of my life. And so what I found was that, and this is a point I'll come back to a lot about your marriage of perma and integral, is how it became psychoactive. As I went through the course, it became psychoactive. And I've said this to you privately, is like, when you build the mind of you build kind of a flourishing mind, it pulls you towards it naturally as kind of a gravitational attractor, because you start to recognize, oh, maybe I'm not feeling as purposeful, or I'm actually not feeling as connected with my friends. And even this week, I thought, I could reach out. There's 3 or 4 really important women in my life that I haven't reached out to in like 3 or 4 months, like my sister, my aunt, and I'm going to pick up the phone this week and do all of that. So I love how that psychoactivity takes hold in this.
That is very beautiful. And I think that's one of the things that I would say the course does, is that it encourages people to take action based on everything that we discuss, and to identify where there's room for improvement in your own life, and then to just do concrete things that make you feel better and that improve relationships and that contribute to flourishing. So it's wonderful to hear that the course is having an effect on you.
Yeah, no, it is. It's really neat. And let's talk about that. So this is really relevant right now, isn't it? We're coming into a year of a pandemic. We've all kind of had our lives put both in stasis and kind of in upheaval in a lot of ways. How are we doing? What are the statistics? Are we doing well as a people? I mean, I know, we're all dealing with a lot of stuff. So what does the data tell us?
Well, it's interesting because the United Nations recently released their annual World Happiness Report. And that says that due to the COVID pandemic, average mental well-being in the United Kingdom in 2020 was almost 8% lower than predicted in the absence of the pandemic. And that about 22% of the population reported significantly lower levels of well-being than before the pandemic. And my feeling is that as more data continues to come in, we'll likely see similar suffering in other countries, which means, as you said in the introduction and Adam Grant said, is that a large number of people across the world are indeed languishing. And I would say that if we revisit Martin Seligman's Perma plus V model, and I'll share a screen again, then it actually makes sense within the categories that he describes. So if we're looking at the Perma plus V model, then first of all, if we look at positive emotion, then we can say that the pandemic has left many people feeling, well, I would say much less happy and more fearful about the future.
Indeed.
And
joy is harder to access when you're reading the headlines we are, and when you're under a state of fear and anxiety.
I agree. And I would also say that, at least from my own perspective, I've been following the news much more intensively since the pandemic, just to keep abreast of all of the government regulations and things like that. But that also means that I'm exposed to that 24-hour news cycle of basically lots of horrific stuff coming from all across the globe, and very little positive stuff. So yeah, I agree. And so that indeed, as you say, joy much less within positive emotion. And then if we look at engagement, then many people are experiencing less engagement at work, so less flow states, either because they're working from home with a lot of distractions, or because they've partially or sometimes completely lost their job, or of course because they're experiencing increased stress levels at work. For instance, think of frontline healthcare workers who are working sometimes ridiculous hours and not being able to recuperate sufficiently. And then if we look at the next category of relationships, then many people have seen their social circles shrink due to lockdown measures. So that what you're just describing about the women you haven't contacted for a while, I think that goes for many people, that that contacts have really shrunk. And I would also say that many intimate relationships have been placed under much greater strain due to more people having to work from home, spending more time in each other's personal space. Sometimes, of course, with children kept home from school as well. I don't know how it was in the United States, but there's been a significant period in the Netherlands where the parents had to keep their children at home and had to school them themselves.
Right.
In addition
we
to all of that,
we had the same effect variously throughout the school districts throughout the United States.
Yeah. So that puts a lot of pressure on families and on relationships. And another thing that I think is also very important is that many people have been deprived of physical touch due to social distancing rules. So that's within the context of relationships. And I would say that within the context of meaning, many people are experiencing less purpose in life than before. And that's due to restrictions in travel, education, work, and of course, social and cultural activities. So I know you just spoke about experiencing a slight decline in purpose that you experience. What would be the main reason for you? Would that be also things like travel and things that you can't do that give you pleasure?
Certainly we've always been, a traveling family, so it does have a big impact on us. In fact, as I said, we were living nomadically right up to the week that almost all the borders shut. So we had come through 4 countries in the prior 30 days, just in that period. So certainly travel is a big deal. And I'm still reflecting on what some of the other things are around the question of purpose. I think what we have found is that as we've done things like this webinar, or the things that we're trying to do with Integral Life with respect to like Integral Life practice, we've tried to adapt what we do to the new reality to be in service to people. And that has been meaningful. But there's been an adjustment. As life changes, you sort of have to be agile enough to say, okay, what can I do to bring the purpose back to me now that things are different than the way they were before?
And that's interesting. And I don't know if this is also relevant for you, but in 2007, there was a large European study done about how people experience their well-being, and levels of well-being were lowest measured in the Russian Federation. And one of the explanations that was given was that meaning is often also impacted by the degree of freedom that we experience to express ourselves, to move about, to take control of our lives, and that more dictatorial governments tend to produce citizens who experience lower levels of well-being. And I was thinking that perhaps within the context of the pandemic, with more restrictions, also from a governmental level, that might also have some impact on our experience of meaning as citizens of countries.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me for sure. And now how about accomplishment?
Indeed. So, well, I would actually add some stuff to the meaning also, because one of the things that I became aware of over the last couple of years is that some people are also experiencing what's called climate depression, and because of many people feel helpless to prevent what they see as the possible future collapse of the Earth's ecosystems. And I think many people are also feeling existential dread about the possible oncoming economic effects of the pandemic. So I think that's also a lot of stuff that's impacting our sense of meaning as well. So
for sure. Yeah.
And indeed, if we look at accomplishment, then, well, many of us, I think, are unable to achieve the goals that are important to us. And if I think of all of the entrepreneurs that have been stunted in their plans to achieve just business goals, and I think that also goes for individuals. And some resources, of course, have also been cut off for people. So achieving goals has become more difficult and more challenging. So, and also within the sense of accomplishment, I would say, like Adam Grant wrote in his New York Times article about languishing, is that many of us are experiencing a drop in motivation to get things done and are much less productive than before. So that's also a factor.
Yeah, if you read some of the comments, just to interrupt real quick on that point, if you read some of the comments to the Times article, there were people would basically say, well, my priorities have really shifted, and I don't, this whole pandemic thing and all the disruption, it's really changed what I care about. So yes, I still want accomplishment, but it's not the same accomplishment as maybe I wanted 2 years ago, because maybe my priorities have shifted. They've deepened in some ways. They've matured. It's like, it's the old, the old adage about you build your career if you lean your ladder against the wrong wall. Well, you climb the ladder and you're still on the wrong wall. And so I think that this whole experience has probably, at least for some people, matured their sense of what's really valuable in their lives.
I agree. And I would also say that it's possibly also contributing to a healthier business climate and a healthy organizational climate, because for years, people have been saying that they can work from home and cut out commuting time. And that's also a big factor in well-being, the duration of commute. And now, of course, organizations have been forced to have their employees work at home, and apparently it does work. So I think what you're pointing to is that, of course, the double-edged sword of any crisis is that it also produces some opportunities.
Well, that's right. I mean, even though we're focusing on the negative aspects in terms of how it might contribute to languishing or not flourishing, it's also worth pointing out there's actually a lot of really beautiful, amazing positives that are coming out of it. And if, as you say, if we're able to work from home as a more sort of integrated part of our work lives because of this experience, and we get the freedom, and we can, take the work trip when we want to, or go into the office or whatever, that sort of integration or synthesis of having that freedom plus the capability to work from home, maybe spend more time with our families, that's really going to be a very big positive. And I think we'll see a lot of that.
I agree. Yeah, I certainly agree. So,
okay.
To conclude, indeed, the perma model in relation to or perma plus V in relation to the pandemic, I would say that if we look at vitality, then many people are feeling less energetic and fit. And of course, probably because many people are exercising less due to lockdown restrictions. And I know of some people who've also been eating less healthily than before.
Drinking a lot more. Alcohol sales were through the roof.
Indeed. So I would say that's one way we can use the perma plus V model to gain deeper insight into the mechanics of why people experience higher levels of languishing than before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But
indeed.
on the other hand, I was going to add that I like the way you were speaking about the positives, because it's not all bad. And on a positive note, there are many people who've also been able to turn this global crisis into a personal opportunity for growth. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, of course, I've been seeing also as someone who's been leading the practices for Integral Life, is that many people in the Integral community have attended the practice sessions to invest in their own well-being. And I would say that's my intention with this course also, is to offer people an additional option to invest in their long-term health and well-being, and hopefully to have some fun and while doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. Integral, I mean, you would expect Integral Life to say, oh, you know, it's the integral model, it's great. And this course is one of the most comprehensive integral courses we've done. And I know our members or our audience might say, well, you know, you've said that before. It's true. But it's also true that this one's a lot bigger. Like, there's a lot going on here. And we'll get into in a little bit. We'll get into the just dozens of practices you've got organized through the integral model and the things that are inside of it. But I was actually really struck just by how comprehensive the approach you took is with respect to the integral model itself. You actually walk people through, putting aside the perma for a moment, you walk people through all of these pieces of the integral model. Then, of course, you marry it together with perma, and then you marry it together under this banner of integral flourishing. So I'm really curious, and I've said this to you, so I'm really curious why you did that and what you found, strengths and weaknesses of these approaches. How did they complement each other? And I think the result was quite brilliant, but I want to hear it in your words.
Well, first of all, thanks for the compliment. And that is absolutely great praise coming from someone who is so close to the heart of integral, the integral community. So I think one of the things that I bring to the table, and we were speaking about this before the call started, is a personality type. So I identify mostly as a personality type 1 within the Enneagram, and they tend to be people who are very detail oriented and who like to do things. I like to perfect things as much as possible. So one of the things that I noticed while I was creating the course was that I wanted to start from scratch. So if you know nothing about the integral model, I wanted you to be able to arrive with, let's say, an open mind, and then to go step by step into a deeper understanding of integral theory. And I also wanted to create it so that if you know a lot about integral theory, you still see a lot of stuff along the way that you perhaps hadn't yet seen. And that's something I think I bring just from my own life experience. And I've heard many people say this before, but I arrived at integral theory when I was already doing a lot of practices on my own. And I'd also done a lot of conceptualizing and thinking about just reality and how things, what's real and how reality works. And what I found was that coming to integral, it was like, oh, I thought about that, but I didn't think about that, and I didn't see that, and I didn't see that. And so Ken Wilber's work specifically was, for me, such an expansion of things that I've been working on myself. So I'm forever grateful to him, and also to people like you and Corey and everyone who's helped to keep this this perspective and this philosophy alive and to spread it. So that's sort of the place I was coming from, and I also chose a methodical structure because, again, I really wanted to offer value to participants regardless of their previous knowledge of integral theory. And I'm pleased to say that earlier versions of this course have been very positively reviewed, both by newcomers to integral theory who didn't know anything before they came to the course, as well as by what we could call integral veterans who even teach integral theory, but who were still able to gather some value from the course.
If I could interrupt on just that note, I mean, I always love, even though I know a lot about integral theory, I always love to hear someone else describe it, because I always pick up some nuance or some angle of perception I didn't have before. And I think, oh, that's really smart, or that's really cool. And it rounds out my own understanding of it. So even though, I mean, obviously I work with it every day, it was really neat to hear how you walked through it, even just by reversing some of the quilts, which we'll talk about here in a moment. That, very clever. It's a very kind of nice way to put it out there.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. And I think that, again, if we look at typology, so personality structures that we all bring to the table, there are things that some of us can bring that others can't bring. And I think one of the things that integral theory helps us to see is that there's room for everyone, and that everyone has a piece of the puzzle and a piece of the truth. And to me, it's very inspiring to see, for instance, Jeff Saltzman, who identifies as a type 5 within the Enneagram, you, who identifies as type 7, Corey, who identifies as a type 4, and Normali, who identifies as a type 4, and to see all of those different perspectives, and how, indeed, as you were saying just previously, there are just things included in some perspectives that are not included in your own, and it's a delight if you can indeed find that. And I don't know if, because I think this is interesting to mention for people, that if they haven't read your piece on the Great Release, I would absolutely advise people to read that, because that was one of the things that I've read that I thought was, I had a similar experience that I thought, wow, I've read Thomas Piketty, the French economist, and I sort of more or less understood what he was saying. But then I read your take on him, and you brought all of these other theoreticians and historians into the mix, and of course framed it within an integral perspective. And economy as a concept just came alive for me more than it had done before. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. So again, if people haven't read your ebook, I would say, please go read it, The Great Release. So. Yeah, thank you. So Perma V marries integral, and we end up with this beautiful framing device for what was the Perma V model. And how did that work out? Well, great question. So the relationship between the Perma plus V model and integral theory. So the way I see it is that the Perma plus V model provides us with specific tools that we can use to experience a greater sense of flourishing, and then generally speaking, mostly in the individual interior and the collective interior dimensions of life, or what integral theory would call the upper left and lower left quadrants. So we feel that we're flourishing, we feel it within ourselves, so in our subjective experience, but we also experience it in our relationships with others. And of course, for those of us who are familiar with integral theory, we know that reality is much larger than those interior quadrants alone. So in a way, this course is saying yes and. It's saying, yes, we can use the Perma plus V model to increase subjective and intersubjective flourishing. And it says we can also use the integral model to ask what it might mean to flourish as a human being across all 5 elements of the integral model. And I'll share my screen once more. So for those participants on the call who haven't delved into the integral model very deeply, it consists of 5 elements. So the quadrants, the intelligences, levels, types, and states. And if we're speaking about moving from Perma plus V flourishing to integral flourishing, then we're speaking about moving from a flourishing within one aspect of reality, and then trying to make it as broad as possible. So we include as much of reality as possible in how we're approaching flourishing. So we could say that integral flourishing is flourishing within the context of the quadrants, within the context of the intelligences or lines of development. So let's say multiple intelligences indeed, within the context of levels. So here it would mean levels of personal development, within the context of types, that would here also mean primarily personality types, and also within the context of states, which here would mean primarily states of consciousness. So I'm not sure whether we need to go into the integral models elements. Rob, what do you think?
No, well, let's go deeper into the perma model. I assume that a lot of our listeners will be at least passingly familiar with the integral model, but we'll come back to that actually when we start to talk about practice, because that's where I think things get really interesting, just in terms of the different really fascinating kind of activities that are lit up. And we'll go through a few of them viewed through the integral lens. So we'll come back to that, but let's get specific around the perma model. And first talk about the P. So positivity, what I think of as joy or positive emotions. So to give us some more specifics about each of these.
Absolutely. So it's interesting that you say indeed positivity or joy, and that's actually how Martin Seligman, who founded the Perma plus V model, thinks about it. He thinks about it as positive emotion singular, as indeed happiness or joy. And other psychologists, such as Barbara Fredrickson, whom we'll probably discuss later also, she thinks more of a range of positive emotions. But within the context of the Perma plus V model, it's indeed a positivity or joy. And in the course, we look at various ways to experience happiness more often. And we discuss the so-called broaden and build theory, which was developed by psychologist Barbara Fredrickson, who I mentioned just now. And she suggests that the evolutionary benefit of feeling happy is that we feel comfortable enough to explore new behaviors, which can increase our chances of survival. So an example of this is, for instance, when we're playing around chasing each other as children, what we're also doing is we're also potentially training ourselves to be able to outmaneuver predators that are chasing us. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we're also potentially training ourselves to be able to catch prey animals which are trying to escape from us. So that's a really interesting perspective on the functionality of happiness. And of course, in addition to discussing theory, we also engage in a variety of exercises to experience joy.
Yeah, and just to touch on that, that's another thing I would mention. Like, I've read a lot of these theorists over the last many years, as you have, and I love Barbara Fredrickson's theory. I love her concept of broaden and build. I think it's an important addition to thinking about what the actual mechanics of the evolutionary process are in the human psyche. And I just want to, I guess, compliment you on the fact that there's so much of good theory that you've brought into this that I was hard pressed to find a lot of gaps. And I guess that was the point of not only bringing in perma, but integral, and then you being as comprehensive as you are. But, you hit on Barbara Fredrickson stuff. You hit on Angela Duckworth stuff on grit. You hit on strengths and why we actually need to rely on our strengths to go into flow states. And so I just want to say that from my point of view, this is also one of the best evidence-based, research-based courses that I've seen come actually through the integral space in a long, long time. Well, so with that as the compliment, I just wanted to mention that. So let's dive into engagement.
Absolutely. So engagement, as you said, flow, and I think that's really, for people who know what flow is, indeed, that's the best description. So a flow state is a state in which we basically merge completely with the activity that we're performing. So many of us have experienced this while working, while playing sports, or while interacting with a loved one, where we lose track of time and feel completely immersed in the present. And it's typically a state of self-transcendence. And speaking
of theorists, so for those who are listening, this is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's a really foundational concept on flow.
Yeah, absolutely. So we discuss Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow, and we also do an exercise to experience a state of flow. Mm-hmm. And in addition, we discuss some further research by Barry Schwartz and others, which suggests that the more we consider our work to be a calling, so a mission, the more likely we are to experience a flow state whenever we're working. And of course, the converse is also true, that if we experience the work we do as a job, where we're looking at the clock thinking, how many more hours do I have to do this? then it's much less likely that we'll experience a flow state at work. So I would say that this harks back to what we were speaking about earlier, that if you can work from home, that it can sometimes be more difficult to enter a flow state, but sometimes it can be more easy indeed. So I'm curious to see where this is going to go in the future with organizations, and how people's engagement measures when they can work from home in a way that they want to.
Indeed. And for those of you who, for whatever reason, decide you're not going to take the course, let me just kind of summarize the take-home value here, I think that you should be listening for, which is, if you want to, what this research shows, if you want to enter a flow state more regularly, what Lee said about sort of thinking about your calling, thinking about purpose, and marrying that with strengths, those areas where you are sort of preternaturally have some talents that stand out, what the theorists would call signature strengths, that combination of things can really be a powerful way to move into flow states and into higher engagement. So I'll continue to try to point out like these areas that you can think about after the webinar is over. So the next sorry, Lee, did you want to comment on that?
Well, no, I thought that was an excellent addition, and perhaps we could even go further and say that within the theory of flow, you're looking for, in the most basic explanation, you're looking for something that requires you to have a particular level of skill. So it challenges your skills, but it doesn't challenge them too much. So it borders between, it doesn't produce anxiety and it doesn't produce boredom, but it sort of balances in between. So if you're a piano player, then you don't want to play just some music that's only one note repeating all the time, but you also don't want to play like something very difficult by Franz Liszt, or perhaps you just want to play something by the Beatles that suits your skills, but is a challenge enough.
That's right. Yeah, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's fine. Good.
So for those of our community members who are familiar with the human developmental models, you will recognize some of this concept from the notion of that fertile territory right at the edge of your skills that is not so, that is challenging, but also you get support in order to sort of to grow. And so one of the things we talk about in human development a lot, and I think of it as a parent, when you want your children to grow, you can't overburden them with a challenge that they can't take on. You need to give them enough support, but it also can't be boring, so there can't be no challenge. And so that happy, fertile ground right between challenge and support is a constant sort of concept in human development itself, and in the growth of the growing up process, and even waking up, in your meditation practice or whatever it might be. And of course, Lee's bringing that in rightly here as being a really robust concept in the notion of flourishing and finding flow as well.
Absolutely.
So relationships. Let's talk more about relationships, the R in the PERMA model.
Indeed. As we were saying before the call, that's also a very important domain for many people, indeed, during the pandemic. And within the context of relationships, we discuss in the course the research of psychologist John Gottman, who studied married couples and who discovered that the best way to completely destroy relationships is to treat others with contempt. So naturally in the course, we discuss how to avoid behaving contemptuously towards others, and instead how to nurture constructive and mutually beneficial relationships. And in doing so, we explore a number of exercises to cultivate compassion and gratitude towards people in our life.
Yeah, it's so important. And of course, Dr. Keith talks about this all the time as well in the Wit and Wisdom show, and how easy it is to develop resentment over time. How to build up these resentments, especially with your significant other, where there's a lot of familiarity, take it for granted, your husband or your wife or what have you, and the resentments build, and before you know it, after 3, 4, 5 years, there's a kind of a hidden ball of resentment you haven't even noticed that you've allowed yourself to cultivate, that then is characterizing a state, frankly, a repetitive state pattern or habit that then comes out with, the kind of things that harm relationships, harm connection, harm a feeling of really beautiful inner subjectivity. So I'm really glad you brought up that concept of both the compassion, and the gratitude in this context. It's really critical.
Well, that's well said. And I think of it also as shadow work, because the course also delves into shadow work. But as you're describing that process of things coming in between in the relationship, I'm thinking of how if you wear glasses or sunglasses, that if they become dirty, then your perception of what you're looking at is influenced. And I would say that resentment then is a sort of a film covering the lenses of our glasses as we look at our intimate partners in life, and that we really need to do the shadow work to clean the lenses of our glasses, so to speak, to be able to connect from that place of purity or authenticity.
That's well said. And it can be so subtle. I mean, that's the thing about this. These things can be so subtle, and you swim in the waters and you don't even totally see it yourself. So again, the psychoactivity of any of the work we do, whether it's this course or the stuff that we do with our shows or whatever, all of it is designed to create a mind, an integral mind that via its psychoactivity is able to kind of self-heal and to see things that are so easily missed otherwise. So I just we'll move to meaning, but that's a really interesting one, I think.
I agree, and there's so much to say about everything that we're discussing. So indeed,
really. Okay, so meaning, purpose.
Yeah, indeed, meaning and purpose. In the course, one of the things we do, at least, is we discuss the work of Viktor Frankl, who many of you might know, who was a Jewish Austrian neurologist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War. And in Auschwitz, Viktor Frankl observed that prisoners who experienced a sense of meaning, despite their horrendous circumstances, that they had significantly greater chances of surviving the camp than prisoners for whom life had lost all of its meaning. So Frankl was working as a camp doctor, treating fellow prisoners. So he saw that people indeed just died or died more easily when they didn't have something to hold on to. And one of the examples he gives is of a person who was able to experience purpose because he wanted to publish an academic paper. And he was keeping sort of a rough version of the paper on him all of the time under his clothes. And that was just enough to sort of hold on to a sort of lifeline. And other people, of course, held on to the idea that they could see loved ones whom they'd left behind. And by studying meaning within such a powerful and overwhelming context, we can then transport it to our lives, which of course are considerably more comfortable and less challenging.
That's right.
And then we can see how we can learn from people who've done things under really difficult circumstances, how we can do them under less difficult circumstances. And we do a number of exercises that help us to live as meaningfully as possible.
What I love about Frankl's work, so he was the founder, for those who maybe don't know, he's the founder of a school of thought named logotherapy. And his classic book, Man's Will to Choose.
Man's Search for Meaning was his first.
Man's Search for Meaning, that's right. And what I like about Frankl's work was the notion of the freedom we have ultimately. It's a very existential concept coming largely in that time, as well as a reaction to the war and the post-war period that we see in a lot of thinkers at that time. But sort of our freedom to choose, our freedom to ultimately hold within ourselves the commitment that makes our life meaningful. And nobody can take that away. And what I like about what you said with respect to the hard conditions in which he was writing is we have no excuse. I mean, we have it great, relatively speaking. Now, not everybody around the world does. I mean, I'm clearly not counting everybody in that picture, but I can speak for myself. I can speak for most of the people I know. We've got it really good. and the gratitude to remind ourselves that we are free to choose. We are free to make a commitment that is meaningful, and we kind of, I mean, I don't want to make it too simple, but like, we just need to be reminded in the morning, we're free to choose to make a commitment to make today meaningful. And it's a practice, and it's a habit, and it's something that we have to bring within ourselves as a commitment that we try to do on a regular basis.
Well, that is very beautiful. And I would say that actually also applies to what we were speaking about earlier with relationships and resentment, because one of the things that I found is that sometimes I can feel, oh, I have to do this, or I have to interact with the person so-and-so. And then I think, well, of course I don't have to, I want to. And that completely changes the dynamic. And then resentment becomes a sort of a childish game of, I force myself to do something, and then I rebel against myself subconsciously. And if you remove that indeed by, as you say, becoming conscious of the fact that we're choosing more or less what we do, then that is some form of liberation indeed, yeah.
That's probably a good segue. The notion of choice is probably a good segue to accomplishment. What's important to us? What do we choose to achieve?
Absolutely. So within the context of accomplishment in the course, we, among others, we explore the concept of willpower as studied by psychologist Kelly McGonigal. And we also discuss ways to cultivate sustainable willpower so we can achieve goals that we most want to achieve in life in a way that's healthy and sustainable indeed. And we also discuss what it means to possess grit, or the ability to persevere, as studied by psychologist Angela Duckworth, whom you mentioned earlier. And we do 2 exercises to test our grit. And in addition, we also explore a method to successfully achieve goals based on a book that I wrote, which I'm currently translating from Dutch into English.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, as a 7, I would say, I'm just going to guess here, and I'm going to pick on myself, I guess, as a type 7, is I think 7s probably stand furthest away from grit as their kind of natural way of being. But what's also true, at least in my case, is tremendous willpower when I want it. And I love McGonigal's work. I love how the concept, you can actually build willpower. So the brain science on this is fairly demonstrative that you can build willpower. You can build a brain that actually gets better at impulse control, impulse resistance over time, at really focusing on the achievement of what you want and sticking with it. And of course, Angela Duckworth's work on the way in which you then stick with it, which is one of the things we try to pass on to our children. And that's the hard part. Like, how do you train the kids for grit? But it's something we're working on constantly, because the kids don't want to have grit. They don't want to play the piano one more time or do the jujitsu one more time or whatever. So it's a constant resistance.
Yeah. And I could imagine that, I don't know how this is for you, Rob, but that for this generation growing up with all of the distractions, that it might be even more difficult, because, for instance, smartphones are so easy to pick up, and then you're down a rabbit hole instead of perhaps indeed practicing something that you would actually prefer doing. So what's your experience with children and indeed distractions?
Well, as we know, even adults are failing at this. You have a very hard time fighting the experiment or the power of an AI-based algorithm that can learn in real time and be deployed across an experiment of 1.5 billion people, like you can with Facebook. So if you just think about that's what's on the other side of your experience, it's no wonder they're winning, because that's a very hard thing to match your individual psychology against when that's what's coming at you. So my belief on this for 10 years, ever since I did my TED Talk to some degree on this, it was actually on a whole bunch of things, but this was one of the components, was, you can't expect your 11-year-old to win that battle when even your self-aware 35-year-old can't win the battle. So what you need to do is you need to create an environment where, to some degree, you're protecting that, until developmentally the capacity for the impulse control, the capacity for the constant feedbacks that are the notifications, the constant dopamine hits that are the likes on Facebook or whatever it is, Instagram or whatever the kids are using now. There's a time and a place for them to transition developmentally, I think, into that. But by the way, this is not just apply to the kids; it applies to us too. As you say, it's like we're all distracted with this crap, and it does become a practice of vigilance with respect to saying, okay, did I just and I use Twitter. I'm not on Facebook, haven't been for years, but I am on Twitter. So I'm constantly asking myself, what's the give and take here? Did Twitter make me its tool? Or is Twitter my tool? I'm constantly in that question. And I'm constantly reminding my friends and followers on Twitter of that exact question. Like, we need to use these platforms as tools. We need to not become their tools. And that requires a level of self-awareness. And again, not to plug the course, but just generally speaking about integral life and integral life practice more broadly, like this is the level of self-awareness I think we need to have as adults. And we need to, speaking about kids, pass on to kids. We need to help our kids have almost like a proto ILP so they can start to cultivate the skills of self-awareness that say, have I given up my agency here? Am I still an autonomous agent that has its own dignity, its own self-worth in this system that wants to turn me into basically just another, component of attention in their business model. That's tricky. And that's certainly, clearly we see that is one of the things, hurting society and democracies and, all these other things. So it's a life condition that we're having to serve.
Well, that's a very, very lucid take on that. And I think indeed, if we're speaking about accomplishment, then that's one of the confounding factors of achieving goals is if there's indeed, if there are distractions that are engineered to distract us, like Tristan Harris says, indeed, with all of these very smart people designing addictive tech. So
that's right. That's right. And that brings us to vitality, which of course is, as I said, and you mentioned the drinking and the food and the habits. So let's talk about vitality.
Indeed. So in the course, when we get to vitality, we explore healthy eating and drinking habits, indeed. And we do a series of physical exercises. And we also get to meet two friends of mine who are former martial arts champions who tell us about nutrition and exercise. And we explore how to get good sleep. And we discuss why drinking alcohol might sometimes leave you feeling thirsty instead of refreshed. And in addition, throughout the course, we also discuss some neurobiology, and we do a number of exercises related to stress and relaxation, and also shadow work.
No, that's lovely. Yeah, one of the things that people ask me, hey, what's one change I can make that will make me feel better immediately? I say drink more water. It's a little simple thing, but 2/3 of the population, 2/3 of adults are chronically dehydrated. It's like, just drink more water. You'll find your energy levels going up. And I guess that's the point, is that you've done a really good job of bringing in a lot of that these upper right components that really are the foundation. And again, speaking about somebody who's got a 13-year-old who likes to, stay up late on the computer, it's like I'm constantly working with him to go, okay, are you really wanting to sacrifice tomorrow for another hour tonight? And that's really the choice, because you wake up tired, sluggish, you don't do your best, etc. And again, there's just another habit to build.
Yeah. One of the ways I tend to think of that is that if we think of subpersonalities, so that our self is composed of multiple tinier personalities that sometimes take the forefront, then we could say that we're choosing to deprive our future self by gorging our present self, indeed. And that can be a way of thinking about that. So
I love that. I often say that if you want to know the decisions somebody made yesterday, look at them today. Or the opposite is, if you want to, the mindset you have today is what will determine what you look and feel like tomorrow. And that's puts a lot of responsibility then on taking, okay, what's actually going on inside me now, in terms of, all the things we're talking about.
True.
So I want to jump into what I think is, I love everything we've talked about already. Like I'm a geek about this stuff, but I think the practice part of this course is really cool. So I want to dive into practice. I'm watching the clock. I know that we've got maybe 33 minutes. I want to leave some time for questions. So we'll go through this fairly quickly, but I want to just mention that the way you did practices is really cool. And so just walk us through real quick some of the practices that you did, and then I'm going to probably pull out some as well, just to highlight, how you touched on states, and just a really cool approach, I thought.
Okay. So one of the exercises we do is the play history exercise, and it's quite a fun exercise. And basically you're invited to draw an overview of all of the activities that you love to do when you were younger as a child. And then you choose from these activities one activity that you would like to do again now as an adult. And it's basically a way of bringing some fun from the past into the present. So that's one of the exercises. And we also
just on that, but just to interrupt a little bit, like, so I've watched my mother-in-law's and her friends all start painting rocks again, and I don't know, maybe this is a thing because there's a lot of rock painting seemingly going on, but it speaks to that. Like there's a way in which I think people are reaching back into an earlier time where they had fun and they weren't as it wasn't as crafted, and they're just doing these things, and she loves it. I mean, she's doing it all the time. She finds it really engaging.
Oh, that's wonderful. And perhaps people are also reaching back to things we used to do before the invention of television and the internet.
Yeah, right.
And things like that.
Right.
Yeah. That's nice. And indeed, in addition, we also do a deathbed visualization exercise. And that might sound a little unsettling at first, but many people actually find it to be really valuable. And the idea is that you visualize yourself on your deathbed, of course, at a ripe old age. And then you look back on a life full of meaningful memories. And what that helps you to do is to identify all of the meaningful things that you would still like to do with the life ahead of you. So that's another exercise.
Deathbed exercises are one of my favorite. I've done them for years. I love them. They're great. I find they don't at all, for me, and many of the people I think do them, they don't at all create any sort of anxiety about death. In fact, if anything, they do the opposite. They kind of liberate one's sense of life, and they defang any anxiety around death, because you realize, oh, I'm choosing life, and this is how, and his is why.
Yeah, indeed, I agree. And so another exercise that we do is we invite participants to reach out to 3 people who know you well, so loved ones, colleagues, friends and family, and we ask you to ask those people to give you feedback about your greatest strengths and talents. So you ask, where did you see me performing a strength or displaying a strength, and then we ask them to give a concrete example. So what this produces is that people receive typically 3 really nice pieces of feedback about themselves, and the exercise also tends to deepen the relationships that you have with the people whom you approach for the feedback.
Yeah, that's really neat. Total side note, but Integral Life built a little platform to do this, to give people that you care about in your life feedback and love. We called it Mirror, so inamirror.com. Where it's just a way of spreading love. That's all it is. Because of exactly that. It's so nice to be able to reflect to someone. We talk about social media. We talk about the distractions and some of the negative news we all see. Well, what if we continue to turn the internet into a place for sending love, which is really important. And so I love that practice too.
And interestingly, if you ask people, and I've done this with classes of students, if you ask people how often they give negative feedback to people when, for instance, they say that they don't like things about behavior, then it tends to be more often than if I ask them how often they give positive feedback about behaviors. And it's just a way of also becoming aware that sometimes it can feel a bit vulnerable to express appreciation towards others, and to make that more comfortable is also one of the reasons why we do the exercise.
Yeah. And again, just for everybody that's listening, even if you don't take the course, I hope that you're getting some ideas of how you can walk away and apply some of these kinds of activities or ideas in your life so that the next week, month, or what have you can start to come a little bit more alive. These are very concrete, practical things that you can take on. Any other practices that you want to share? And then I'll mention a few just because I think they're cool.
Well, one, you mentioned states, and there's an exercise that many people have also enjoyed is a guided visualization exercise that takes you on a tour from the beginning of the universe to the formation of galaxies and stars to the formation of the Earth and its inhabitants, all the way to the present moment. And the goal of the exercise is to provide participants with, if possible, an intense personal experience of the intimate relationship that each of us has with the entire universe, and of course also with each other.
Yeah.
So that's another one that I personally also like.
I love that. And I love, I mean, Ken's writing is there's nobody better on this writing wise than Ken. The idea that the universe is in you in a holonic sense, like genuinely speaking, you're not only the most significant thing in the known universe, but all of the fundamental nature of the universe, everything is fundamental in the holonic layers is also in you. That's your composite being. So literally the universe is inside you. And that's gorgeous. And that sort of state shifting awareness is really powerful. I'll just mention a couple of others that you've got here. You've got activities on emotional and mental awareness, existential awareness. I think that's kind of what we were just referring to. It may be a different practice, but I mean, that kind of awareness, witness awareness, unity awareness. You get into types around, you have practices around types, communion and agency, the big 5 types, which is my favorite personality model. You get into levels. You have practices around shifting into lower levels versus shifting into later levels or higher levels. You've also organized the practices by quadrant. So we've mentioned some of the stuff that's in the upper right, excuse me, in the upper left, the lower left, contribution in the lower right, and the deathbed, the superhero exercise, the golden shadow and dark shadow exercise. I mean, this is why when somebody, when we first looked at the course and said, well, how do we position it? It was like, God, there's a lot here. There's so many cool things. It's actually quite hard to unpack it, but you've really done a nice job. I want to congratulate you, but I love how the integral model does actually give a really beautiful kind of indexing system to hold all the things that are actually going on.
I agree. And yeah,
go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say that one of the things that integral theory does is it allows us to see how everyone is right, but partially right. And when you were speaking about types, one of the things I personally really enjoyed about making the types module is how in the culture war currently many people are going at each other's throats about the differences between sex and gender and things like that. And if you introduce integral theory into the conversation, everybody can be right and can have their place across the quadrants, and it's just a way of sort of alleviating the tension between seemingly paradoxical perspectives, which actually fit together perfectly if you look at it from a broader perspective.
And one of the things I try to point out to folks is that in some ways, at root, it can actually be really legitimately and sort of justifiably selfish, in the sense that this is what you want to experience. Don't worry about fixing other people. Allow this framework, the integral framework, to heal the lack of joy in you when you see the otherness. And what happens as you do that, as you have that kind of selfish, motivation, I'm using selfish is probably not the right word, but when you're saying, well, actually, I want to heal myself first, you become you become a transformative agent yourself, because you're no longer operating from fear. You're able to empathically relate. You're able to have more compassion for otherness, and you're able to serve in a very different way with love that helps others become less fearful. And so speaking to what you just said is actually really, really important, is that it's not just about kind of healing the world. It can also be, boy, wouldn't it be nice if I use this to bring all of this alive within myself, and then I become the agent of transformation.
Well said.
So I've said before, the way we summarize the course is you sort of build this psychoactive mind of integral flourishing. It brings in, higher functioning, more meaningful engagements, deeper connections, more flow-oriented activities. I think that it can work quickly, as we've said. This stuff can happen, within an hour, 2 hours, today, this week, and it can also work, as you build this mind of flourishing over time. Is there anything else that you would add to that?
Well, I like that framing that you spoke about earlier. Also, is that it's psychoactive. So you sort of acquaint yourself with the terrain, and in some intriguing way, the theoretical frameworks influence our behavior. And it's as if the clearer we see the map, the easier it is to navigate towards our highest potential within that map.
Yeah.
So that's in relation to, indeed, the psychoactive nature. And another thing I would add is that it can be quite powerful to share your experiences of the exercises with others. And that's why, for people who are taking the course, we'll provide them with access to a private group where they can come together with other participants and discuss theories and practices in the course.
Yeah, that's really lovely. So this is a moment where, with the remaining 20 minutes, and we can stay over for a little bit, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. This is a moment where I'm going to provide a little bit of instructions. If you want to start, the folks listening in want to participate with some questions. If you have any questions, there are two ways to engage. First, you can click the raise hand button, which will tell us you want us to turn on your camera and have some real-time discussion, or you can submit a written question by clicking the Q&A button, and we will read it on air. There is so as those things are beginning to come in, I will just ask Lee one final question of my own, which is, what would you say directly to listeners right now about, people who have maybe taken a human development course, what this might contribute to them?
That's a good question. Well, I would say that, as we've been saying throughout this webinar, is that the course essentially represents 24 years of my professional life, and it combines many of my most important insights and experiences and knowledge. So in a way, it's a life's work in a single course. And people who've taken earlier versions of this course, they've typically received a great deal of value. And as you said, it's quite a humongous course, and it consists of 83 videos, 17 audio exercises, and 64 other practical exercises, which are all intended to help people enhance their well-being, increase their resilience, and deepen their self-insight. So if you take the course, you'll discover that it really is about you, about whoever's taking it as the participant, and about how you can optimize the quality of your life in a practical way. And based on the experiences of participants in previous versions of the course, it's perhaps a very British way of saying it, but I feel confident in claiming that if you follow this course from start to finish and you do all of the exercises, then you'll likely be very satisfied with the results that you experience in your life.
Lovely. All right. Well, that's a great place to jump into Q&A, and probably should mention, Lee, while we're here, that it is you plan on having a private discussion group that is associated with the course as well.
Yes. The thing is, one of the things people really enjoy is not just to experience their own or to have their own experiences of the exercises, but also to resonate with others. And I mean, you and I have seen this throughout the Integral Life practice sessions, is that the most lively aspects of those sessions are typically where participants are interacting with each other around particular themes. And the same thing has been my experience with courses that I've taught and developed, is that when people get together and they're engaged together around these themes, it can really produce some interior magic between people. So that's one of the things we would like to offer, indeed. Yes.
And is that something you'll be participating in or contributing in any way to?
Yes. So the way I could see it indeed sort of being a practice group where I just set the stage and perhaps give some exercise instructions, or we go through some of the exercises that people have already done. And it's basically, then I'll be mostly facilitating, in the sense that it's about the people who are taking the course and about their experiences. And of course, if they have questions, then they can ask them. And sometimes when I've done these previously, some of the most interesting answers to questions come from the people who are on the call.
Yeah, of course.
So,
of course.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me just read some of the questions. All right. Scott asks, suggestions on maintaining and enhancing relationships with people who are not pursuing integral studies as I/we change and the people we relate to do not.
Well, that's an interesting question, Scott. And I know that some people suggest that you should sort of carve out your own path through life and follow your own path of development and leave people behind who are unable to keep up with you. But my experience has been that, or at least my perspective is that we share with people in our lives aspects of ourselves, and that if we're able to develop ourselves and to remain in contact with people and continue to share what we shared with them, that we also honor parts of ourselves that we perhaps no longer feel attracted to as we used to, but that are still part of ourselves. So I would say that if you can continue to relate to people from your past based around the things that energized you in the past together, that you can actually be a role model for people in the way that you then embody the change that you are seeking and are creating in your own life. So I'm not sure if that's sufficient answer. Rob, do you have any?
It's a great question. It's something we actually see a lot in our community for reasons that Scott is alluding to, that what happens when somebody joins Integral Life. I mean, when people on our Join Integral Life page, I say, look, I promise you, you're going to grow here. I don't promise stuff lightly. Like, I'm kind of a no nonsense guy in that sense. I'm a highly integrity filled guy when I say something and I mean it. And I mean it. Like, you're going to grow. If you actually participate with us at all over the course of a couple of years, you're going to grow up a lot. You're going to wake up a lot. You're going to clean up a lot. And you're going to show up a lot. Even if to some degree you don't totally mean to. Like, you're going to listen to stuff. It's going to intrigue you. You're going to do some practices. Like, it's going to happen. And what happens when that happens is exactly what Scott's alluding to. You have somebody that may be being left behind a little bit. The thing is, though, because you change and you're becoming more compassionate, you're becoming more skillful, you're becoming more open and aware, you also see all the ways that you contribute to the very things you think's wrong with them. Like, it's not just about them not growing up. It's also about your participation in the ways that you're not empathizing enough, that you're projecting. You are bringing your own shadow into it. And the thing that I've noticed is that as you do that, as you become more skillful, as you become more compassionate, as you become more loving, as you become more capable of staying in intimate contact, that person comes with you to some degree. That person often feels like you've created a space where the fear and the contempt and the defense mechanisms often kind of come down. Now, I'm not saying that's a universal story. I mean, certainly it's just, there are cases where people just grow apart because one person is growing a lot faster and the other person, for whatever reason, is not going to do that. But there's also the other beautiful story where actually one person acts as a kind of a gravitational magnet for the growth of someone else. And it is their very commitment, I'll use marriage, like that lifelong commitment that constantly reminds you to come back to the practice of staying in touch with that. And that very commitment of who am I in this? What am I doing? Becomes the role model you're talking about, Lee.
That was very beautifully said, Rob, and a very nice translation of what I was trying to say. So, and indeed, I would add to that of course, an exception would be if you're dealing with people who suffer from personality disorders or things like that, where of course the relationship is destructive for you and potentially for the other person. But I find that a very beautiful framing, Rob, where you stay true to your own development and try to relate to people from there, no matter how far or high you're developing. Yeah.
And I think probably one of the main distinctions in relationships that are able to go on that journey versus those that aren't is because, I mean, a lot of people are getting married in their early 20s. None of us know who we are in our early 20s, right? We make commitments that to some degree are much bigger than us, and they kind of have to drag us along, and we either grow into them or we don't. But one thing that sits at the core, I think, of successful relationships in the integral life community and those who aren't is, do they have some basic foundational commitment to each other's growth and their own? Meaning, are they at least open-minded enough to be present for that? And if someone is dealing with a lot of shadow, they're dealing with a lot of trauma, they're dealing, as you say, with certain kinds of dysfunctions that just need a lot more work or a lot more therapy or what have you. Well, sometimes that can be, there's a lot more professional therapy that might need to be done. But for those who share some part of each other's growth and awakening as a component, it can work really well. All right, let me jump into the next question. Marcy asks, how would you characterize the difference or sameness of resiliency and flourishing? So resilience versus flourishing.
So that's another very good question. And I think that we could perhaps say that that resiliency is almost a trait that we can develop and cultivate, whereas flourishing is the result of certain actions that we take and certain attitudes that we cultivate. So that would be where I would start. And resiliency is, or anti-fragility, or however you want to frame it, is basically, I would say, our capacity to meet adversity with flexibility and to stay true to ourselves regardless of disturbing circumstances, and to bounce back from challenges and to overcome obstacles and things like that. And so I would say that resiliency is something, if we're looking at the perma plus V model, for instance, I would say we could perhaps fit resiliency within the accomplishment category as something that can help you to achieve goals and to stay on the path that you've chosen for yourself. So that would be my reply. Rob?
That's great. Well, my answer would be similar, I think, just in the sense that when you do the skill building that you're offering here, in the context of the perma V model or the quadrants, what have you, that skill building itself becomes the way in which you're resilient. Your happiness set point, for example, that thing you tend to go back to after you get punched. That's something that you're going to have a easier time doing when you are flourishing. And it's going to be easier to flourish when you are doing the very things we're talking about, the very activities. And it sounds stupid, but like, hey, drinking water, getting the good night's sleep, spending some energy, walking, being in gratitude, staying connected with loved ones, doing purposeful work, being in flow. It's not to suggest it's just a checklist, but if you're doing that, if you're in flourishing and you get punched with the bad news or the thing that wants to take you out of resilience, guess what? You're a hell of a lot more resilient. That's just a fact. So I would say they're actually quite intimately related. They're not exactly the same concept, but they're quite intimately related.
Well said. I like that.
I think Tom asks a great question here, which I'm really glad he asked it. He says, look, the amount of content sounds overwhelming. How would you recommend pacing the content and tips on the right timing? And I was going to actually ask you this. Is there a way in which people can look at the course and go, okay, I'm going to touch in here. I mean, maybe I do the introduction, but I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit based on what I feel is calling me or is up for me at a given time? Or is there a different way that you would suggest digesting it?
That's another great question. The way I set it up is that it is linear and chronological. So the modules or the units, they are sequential and they do build on each other. So I do refer to earlier things in later modules. So, but of course you can also bounce around. It's a question of what you're comfortable with and what your ultimate goal is with the course, of course.
Somebody might come in already knowing a fair amount about the integral model, for example, and go, I really want to work on purpose, which is another question. So I'll go ahead and I'll just refer to this. Who said, this person said, I came in late, is purpose addressed in the course? The answer is yes. But yeah, so you come in, you say, well, I really want to work on purpose. So now I'm going to go to that section of the course. I'm going to do that. And then maybe I go elsewhere. I'm not, what you're saying is, well, yeah, but you wouldn't want to do that unless you had the overview of what perma V was, and you want to obviously understand the integral stuff. But somebody could go to different aspects if they had more of a sense of what they needed.
Well, absolutely. And I think we're also that it's also a personality type thing again, because as you said earlier, I've set the course up very methodically, and that's also because I tend to do that myself. So if I'm reading, I tend to read from start to finish, and if I'm watching a film and it doesn't really doesn't really interest me that much, I tend to give it a chance and sort of watch it to the end. So that is also a personality type trait. So I find this a difficult question to answer because, of course, you can pick and choose, and you'd lose some of the linear consistency, which is, of course, no problem. But I think there is something to be said to follow it consecutively, in the sense that it is like a story, and it does build on each other. But again, that might also be my personal preference. So
sure. Well, let's go to the timing thing, because that's the other part of the question. Is okay. So somebody's going to do it beginning to end. Are we talking about 2 weeks, 30 days? 60 days. I mean, there's obviously a lot of different ways that somebody could take it down. You could do it the whole thing fast and then kind of go back through methodically. So what do you think there?
Well, I think it's good to have enough time to assimilate all of the information, to let it really sink in, and to do the exercises. So if we're speaking about time, I would actually say take a couple of months at least to engage with the material. And but then again, that's also very individual based, because some people are extremely fast information intakers. I imagine you, for instance, reading multiple books at the same time and then really devouring them. Is that true?
Yeah, I have a lot of books.
So I would say that also depends on what you would like. But let's say, if we look at the units, then Corey set it up that there's 14 modules or 14 units. If you take 1 to 2 weeks for each of those units, then I think that's a nice tempo that gives everyone enough time to do the exercises, assimilate the information. and also let it sink in. Indeed.
And just to put it in perspective, I mean, a given module might actually only be, in terms of actual elapsed time of content, maybe 15 or 20 minutes of investment, depending on how long the media is or how long the practice is. But in terms of the time commitment, somebody could probably pace that based on what they were feeling, drawn to. Let's see. So we talked about resilience. I think I'm looking at the queue to make sure did I get any other questions? Okay. Good. Well, we're coming up right on the half hour. So that was actually worked out well. If you have any final questions, please feel free to, excuse me, put them in there, and we'll try to answer in the last few minutes. One of the things I was going to mention also in terms of the pacing of the course, or the way it lays out, is Lee was nice enough to prepare a practice guidebook that gives you a sense of the overview of all the practices. And it's cool because it's by quadrants and states and types, and that's kind of neat. So you can get kind of an overview. Is there anything you want to say about that, Lee?
Well, no, just to give you credit, it was your idea. It's a wonderful idea, because one of the things I ran into is when you create a course like this, which is very broad and very deep, so it's a large scope, is how do you then sort of bring everything together? So I had a system for that, and you basically pointed me in a direction that could make it much more optimized, and I really like that. So you suggested creating a practice book, so people also have the practice book even if they finish the course, and they can always go back to the practice book and see, for instance, I want to do an exercise related to mental intelligence today, or I want to do an exercise related to the lower left quadrant. Yep. And you can just look up one and you can do it if you want to.
Yeah, and as a 7, that's how I would use it. But as you say, everybody's gonna kind of approach their own transformative process differently. So that's cool. So just a couple of housekeeping items. So what we're doing is, this is the launch weekend. The course just went live this morning. It's a $195 course. We are discounting it down to $125 this weekend only. And of course, if you're an Integral Life member, you get another 25% off that. So it gets you right to the $100 mark. So about half off. Candidly, we don't really make a lot of money on these kinds of things. We do it because we're trying to bring the best people in the community and their contribution to you in these different things, whether it be Loving Completely with Keith's course, or Flourishing with Lee's course, or what have you. It gives you a way in which you have a broad catalog of things to choose from, because we can't cover everything with just our dialogues that we do on Integral Life. We can't cover everything through Integral Life Practice. We also have a course catalog that you can then engage with in more deep dive areas that you want to. So just so you understand kind of the philosophy of how Integral Life brings forward its offerings to our members, that's what we do. And of course, you don't have to be a member to participate in the course as well. So with that, thank you for Lee, first to you for joining us on this. So this was really cool. It's always lovely to chat with you. And I hope that as people get to know you more, they will come to love you as we do. And for anybody joining us, thank you for participating, and feel free to jump into the course. I think it's really going to be very, very valuable for you. And I know we'll all stand by to support you in any way that we can. And of course, Lee will as well, inside of the private discussion group for the course itself. So Lee, I'll let you take us out.
Well, thanks, Rob and Corey, for helping the technical side of the webinar. And thanks, everyone, for attending. And I hope to see you all on the course or during the Integral Life Practice sessions that I also host. So thanks, everyone, and thanks, Rob.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Take care.